Hi, Misha here, and started doing this channel talking about starship models, and then moved into real-world aircraft, and then moved into armor, partially out of boredom, partially because a few people had asked me and it seemed interesting. Mostly have done videos on Russian armor, just because of my own connections. But, yeah, I've tried my best to really cover British, and we will start doing French because they're very important in some ways. But now let's begin with something that'll probably take me quite a long time to finish up, looking at German armor, the Panzerwagen, the Panzers. And when you think of Panzer, you think of something big like this tiger here. But this is really the last in a series. This is the Panzer Mark Six. Big, heavy tank. Grossly expensive and all that. And heavy. But in actuality, the Panzers started off, at least for World War II era, as very small light tanks. So, in the first video, we're going to look at the Panzer I and Panzer II, SD Kfz.101 and SD Kfz.121, their official Waffenamt designations, Ordnance Department. It's really hard to do a video separating these. I tried, so instead of two shorter videos, you're going to get a longer one, but they're just so very much entwined because both were interim measures, were stopgaps, if you will, in the 1930s, because what Germany really wanted, what would evolve into the Panzer III and Panzer IV, were taking longer than they expected. So we ended up getting quite large numbers of the 1 and 2. And one day we'll get back to the Tiger 1 and 2, but that'll be a few videos later on. I just thought I'd bring it out for a quick little comparison just to show you the size here. It's quite amusing. Well, let's go back to the Treaty of Versailles, or Versailles if you live in Kentucky. Don't at me about that. I'm not mocking our friends in Kentucky. Center for Our Systems is in Versailles, and that's how they pronounce the town. It did confuse me at first, though. I have two 172 scale models here. The Panzer II I've had for a while, a couple of years. This is from Hobby Master, and these are pretty easy to find. This is the F model. I've been waiting for a trigger to get me to do the German videos, and this is actually what did it. This is a Panzer I. This is actually a very difficult model to find, at least in 172 scale diecast. I was browsing eBay a couple of weeks ago and happened to see a seller I've bought from many times in trust, and lo and behold, he had one. And these are very inexpensive. It's like 20 bucks, 15 bucks, free shipping. It is metal. It does have a rotating turret. Both of them do. Rubber tracks. I don't know what brand name this is under. It's the same mold you'll see for Atlas, DeAgostini, and a couple of others. But it's fine. It comes in a case. But then, once I got this, I thought, okay, I've got all the Panzers and a lot of the support vehicles. I felt ready to try tackling this subject matter. But I know some of you out there are true experts on German armor. I am not. I'm a blind guy who just really loves history and thinks models are cool. So with that, yeah, let's delve back in time a bit. On to this mini thing, and back to the Treaty of Versailles. It did not allow the Weimar Republic, the military, to design, build, or field any kind of vehicle that could be used for military applications. It had strict penalties for that. And that was just part of the whole thing, mostly pushed by the French after World War I. Some in the government and military were fine with this, pretty complacent, lethargic. World War I had been very humiliating and demoralizing for the Germans. But others kind of covertly looked around. German industry was quietly encouraged to keep their finger on the pulse of technology. And actually a deal was struck with the Soviet Union, of all people, to share technology and actually to establish a German training center in Kazan, USSR, for German tank crews and everything. Of course, this is all under code names and all hush-hush. There was even some interaction and ordering and stuff with Sweden, who was doing pretty good at the technological level at this time. All very kind of quiet during the Weimar era. They're thinking about doctrine at most. And in 1926, work begins on the large, or later we could call it heavy tractor, the Gross tractor program. Now this is a whole other path from the Panzer I and II, but it did result in half a dozen pre-production tanks that would see some limited field use, just to try them out. But the point is, in 1930, the idea was to have a light tank, although it was called a light or little tractor, to kind of disguise what it was. And it was to be quick, mobile, and be armed with machine guns. Today that seems a little nuts to us, but you gotta remember, in World War I, the tank was brand new, and in the late 20s, early 30s, there were plenty of tanks, either just armed with a pretty small diameter cannon, or, yeah, just machine guns. So it wasn't too nuts. And at this time, the company Krupp was kind of taking the lead and started working on various things, and lots of names were used and code names, but most amusingly, agricultural tractor was used as a euphemism. So, yeah, this started off for something for farmers. And some people come to note here, even before old Adolf, including Heinz Guderian. Guderian would end up being pretty much the preeminent thinker in Germany about what the role of tanks in the armored corps would be going forward. Originally, he thought of having 3 tanks, basically a slow, heavily armored tank with lots of machine guns and a pretty small, or at least low velocity gun, a faster vehicle that had a bigger gun, and then a really heavy vehicle for breaking fortifications that had a big giant cannon. So basically light, medium, and heavy tanks, or infantry, cruiser tanks, and assault tanks if you want to go more British. This gained some traction, and of course in 1933, the Fuhrer came in and he officially allowed the establishment of the 1st Panzer divisions, but they're still trying to play the game of adhering to the Treaty of Versailles. But after the depressions and the deflation of currency and all that, not many people cared. This was something that it was an open secret. Work progressed. 1934, there's a lot of changes back and forth, prototypes, and Krupp gets an initial order for about 130, 150 tanks. They argue back and forth about how many to build. Eventually it was settled on 200. Other firms were brought in to see how they could do, Rheinmetall being one of them, working on various things. In 1934, some tanks were delivered that were expressly for training. Yeah, not all Panzer I's were trainers. Actually, most weren't. These did not have turrets at all, and they had mild steel armor or boilerplate, so they were never combat capable. But in 1935, the first combat capable versions would be delivered, and in August of that year, Germany would start to organize its Panzer divisions, and it wouldn't be long before this tank would see combat just over a year later. The Panzer I weighs about 5 to 5.5 tons, not very heavy. It's only about 13 feet long, so yeah, not very long. Has a crew of 2. We have a driver, he hangs out, and we have a commander in the turret, single-person turret, who doubles as the gunner. Not a whole lot to say about it, frankly. The armament were 2 7.9 or 8mm MG-13 machine guns, standard medium and heavy machine gun in Germany at the time, with about 2,200 rounds of ammunition that was stored in 25-round magazines. So, machine guns, that's it. It originally did not have a full radio set, although a radio receiver was often present with the earlier versions. Later versions would end up with a radio transmitter and receivers. Command tanks would become quite prominent. Quite a few of the later ones were command tanks. The armor was very, very light, only to protect it against small arms fire. Only about 13 millimeters at the maximum, so only about half an inch. And that could even skirt down to 7 millimeters in some areas, so only about a quarter inch. No illusions about it putting up a fight against anything. The suspension and road rail arrangement would change a few times. It is worth saying the earlier series, the Ost A's, Model A's, had an air-cooled engine. The Ost B's, which was kind of an update that the Waffen-Amt pushed Krupp to go for, introduced a couple of years into it. They had a liquid-cooled engine that delivered almost double the horsepower. It also powered an electric generator to power the radio. And they would go to a lightened, shortened version of the machine gun known as the MG-13. And some later versions would have extra armor bulked on, going up to about 30 millimeters. Speeds were pretty respectable, about 37 kilometers per hour on road. Range was fine. Mobility for the A model was a little eh. When they went to the B for the new engine, they extended it out, not much, just over a foot. This gave a longer suspension, longer thing. It had a new bogie road wheel. That actually improved the ride and stability quite a bit. But it's still a very lightly armed and lightly armored vehicle. And originally, they were only going to produce a few hundred. But in 1936, with the Panzer Ii and IV programs kind of behind schedule, Krupp and others were ordered to produce 1,000 more of the Panzer Is. And again, these were not intended necessarily for training. They were meant to give the new and still very raw and green Panzer crews something to practice on. It was inexpensive. They could build them quite quickly. They didn't consume a ton of resources. And it was a way to practice tactics and techniques. So in a way it was training, but it was kind of more on-the-job training than actually being training. There were true trainers that had the mild steel armor. There were also some built that were shipped without turrets, but they were designed in such a way that they could be fitted with a turret, and they were shipped from the factory with the true ordnance-grade steel. So some were kind of optional either-or tanks. You get a few different types. And like I said, there was also a command version. With the A model, they built just under 1,200 standards, plus command tanks, plus some trainers. With the B model, which was introduced in 1936, they would only build just a hair under 400 standards, but then they would build over 150 command alone, plus trainers, plus conversions. All told, they produced over 2,200 of these, if you count the trainers. Even if you don't, you're looking at over 1,600 combat-capable versions, 1,800 if you count the command types too. Not insignificant, and it did see use. But it was the first mass-produced tank in Germany ever. We're still kind of maintaining the fiction at this time, but it wouldn't last forever. By 1938-39, it would be officially announces the Panzer.1 and received the SD Kfz.101 Waffen-Amt Ordnance Department designation. And his first combat, probably most famous combat, was in Spain. The communist Republicans and the nationalists, the fascist nationalists under Franco, broke out in their civil war in the summer of 1936, and both Russia and Germany, who had once cooperated on tank development, now they didn't ever since Hitler came in, he put the kibosh to that whole idea, decided this would be a great area to try out their new vehicles and tactics and everything. So they prepared to send vehicles and even personnel there to fight on their respective sides in Spain. Now, Russia would be the first in mid-October to deliver around 50 of their T-26 tanks. One of their newer tanks, not the cutting edge, but newer. But it wouldn't even be a week later that Germany would respond by sending 40 Panzer Is to combat them. And it wouldn't be long before tank battles would break out, first fighting other vehicles and then eventually themselves. This would also be when Molotov cocktails were found to be a fun little thing to play with on the battlefield. It was soon discovered, though, that of course the Panzer I was at a pretty big disadvantage. The T-26, while not a fantastic tank, had thicker armor and it had a larger main gun. And of course the original T-26s, like the model 1931, 32s, they had machine guns as well. But soon that would go to a 37mm cannon and then a 45mm cannon. The cannon on the T-26 could very easily punch through the Panzer I here. Heck, the 45mm gun on the BA-10 armored car could. The Panzer, if it wanted to punch through a T-26, had to close within pretty close range and use hardcore armor-piercing rounds and then, hope they can wreak enough chaos. But it was relatively quick, and this experience really helped them refine the design, work things out, and it bought time for German industry to work on other projects. The final delivery to Spain would come in January of 1939, and at that time they had shipped them a little over 130 tanks, mostly B models, but some A's as well. And of course the T-26s were there. The Spanish did look into upgunning these with various options, but none of them really proved feasible. The fact is, this was designed to be a machine gun tank, and there wasn't a heck of a lot you could do with that, frankly. So ultimately, the Panzer I's production would soon kind of end after that war, but not its service. Another major and important foreign user of note, the Nazis sold 10 of these to the Republican Chinese, the ROC, who immediately put them into combat against the Japanese. It's kind of funny because after the fall of Nanking, the Japanese captured some of these panzers. Now, the Japanese and the Germans were friendly at this time, so their enemies having German tanks could have been problematic. But no problem, the Japanese simply said these tanks must have been made in Russia, made in the USSR, so definitely not German. We have no problems here, nothing to see, nothing to look at, move along. As far as German use, we know when they went into Austria and Czechoslovakia, most of the Panzer Corps consisted of either the 1 or the 2 we're about to talk about, so the smaller versions. In fact, the vast majority. When they went in to Poland, this would continue in September. There were very few 3s and 4s available. In fact, there were probably more captured Czech tanks in service. These interim tanks ended up basically filling the ranks, and this would continue into France, Norway, the Netherlands, and the numbers would start to go down, 700-800 down to 500. The last major deployment, at least in European theater, would be with Operation Barbarossa into Russia, June 22nd, 1941, when just over 400 of these were deployed there as part of a 3,300-strong tank force. A few had also been sent down to northern Africa in Rommel's command, not many, and he very quickly took the Panzer I out of frontline service because Rommel was kind of smart like that. And they appeared here and there in other areas, but yeah, Barbarossa was the last major deployment. And, well, if the T-34 and KV-1 were a shock to other German tanks, that should tell you that the Panzer I didn't even stand a chance. It was used to harass infantry. It was used as a reconnaissance and scout vehicle, but in no way, shape, or form could it go up against anything like not only Russian tanks, but even Russian armored cars for the most part. So they cruised around. Of course, the losses were there. But by the end of 1941, they pulled all the Panzer Is out of major frontline service, and they would kind of be retired to secondary roles or put on very quiet theaters. They continued to use them for reconnaissance a bit, even though it wasn't the best scout tank, it'd work. And they would actually modify some into towing vehicles or other supply vehicles. And some of them would have their turrets pulled off, and the turrets would actually be installed on fixed fortifications, most notably the Atlantic Wall. So they would still be kicking around throughout the war. The final sale we know about, in 1942, 14 were sold to Hungary. And they would use these in combat that year, but just a little bit. If these were in Russia afterwards, they were basically there just to harass partisans or terrorize the civilian population, because again, any military asset. But it really let them learn a lot about suspension, engine, armor creation, and guns and training personnel and what was and wasn't needed, including going to much bigger turrets. It also showed them the importance of radio and just general communication with one's friendly forces. So it really is the first, and very important for what it was. So what about the second? The Panzer I was planned for, again, going all the way back to around 1930. Interim tank, kind of to work things up. The Panzer III, or at least the vehicles that would become the Panzer III and the Panzer IV, were also very much planned for, going back to Guderian's, plans. The Panzer II, though, was not. This really was a stopgap, not even so much an interim solution. Yeah, by 1933, right when old Adolf ordered the Panzer Corps to be founded, it was pretty clear that things were going to take a while on the 3 and 4, and that the 1, while promising in some aspects and useful, at least according to some, others actually disagreed vehemently and said it was a waste of resources, but it couldn't do much of anything. So in January of 1934, the Waffenamt released specifications for a new light tank. It thought 10 tons and specified that it be fitted with a 20mm autocannon, or in German speak they usually went with centimeters, so it'd be a 2-centimeter cannon. And pretty much the usual firms were asked to submit prototypes, and they would get to work. And by 1935, various designs, prototypes, concepts were shown off. And actually, this time, while Krupp did submit something, theirs was rejected out of hand by the Waffenamt. In the end, after trial and evaluation, they actually combined 2 designs to make the Panzer II here, later designated as the SD Kfz.121. Elements from a design from Mann and another from Benz were both used, and it was basically upscaled Krupp Panzer I style chassis, so you can give some credit there too. It was really just even the 2 centimeter autocannon was something pre-existing. It was originally an anti-aircraft gun. So they were kind of just putting it together as they could. The official go-ahead was given in 1935. Some prototypes were built, and in 1936, a limited series would begin, and production of these would last until the summer of 1937. They'd build around 100, just, sub-series of early versions. But then the first version, the Ausführung A, the A model, would come around. This would be followed by the B and C in 1938, 39, and these are basically make-work models to give the factories something to do, to hone their skills with until they could start producing more important things. This model is actually of the F, which was introduced in early 1941, so just before the invasion of Russia and all that, and it's mostly just an up-armored version. But this would make up the bulk of the Panzer Force. This little light tank here. Really, until the early years of World War II. Kind of interesting. Originally, this was about 8 tons. By the end, it would be 9 tons, sometimes even 9.5 tons with added armor. It is a little bit longer than the one. It's about 16 feet long. It has that 2-centimeter autocannon, which actually has a very high rate of fire, up to 600 RPM, at least theoretically. And it carries 180 shells for it. And it uses 10-round magazines. So, of course, that will limit the rate of fire a little bit. Coaxially mounted to it, we have a 7.92 millimeter machine gun, 8 millimeter machine gun, whereas the one used the MG-13. This used the much newer MG-34. And it would carry the same number of 8 millimeter rounds for that as the one had for both of its, 2,250. It had a crew of 3. We had a commander and gunner in the turret. We had a driver in the front left hull. And we had a loader that actually sat behind the driver on the floor, so kind of under the commander's butt. He would help him, hand him ammunition in the magazines, change belts out. He would also operate the radio, which was now becoming very much a standard feature on most German tanks. Armor originally wasn't much more than the one. Only about 14.5 millimeter, so just basically the same, just a little over half the inch. This tank, unfortunately, was kind of designed before experiences in the war in Spain, or it probably would have been fitted with more armor from the get-go, but oh well. Now, it never saw use in the Spanish Civil War. For whatever reason, they held these back. They did not send them to Franco. It would have to wait until really the invasion of Poland to see live combat, although it was around for the invasion of Czechoslovakia too. It had a very good top speed, originally just right at 40 kilometers per hour for most of the models, and had a pretty reliable engine, all things told. And the gun was quite reliable, although its armor penetration was understandably a little on the limited side. I should point out that there was some experimenting going away from the leaf suspension system, leaf spring, to using a torsion bar, something that's famously used in Russia on the Kv-1. They only built, well, not even 100 Model Ds and Model Es that had this system. It did give it a much higher top speed of 55 kilometers, but that was only on road. If you tried to go cross country, things deteriorated quite quickly. There were other issues, so yeah, with the F here, they returned to the original leaf spring. With the F, they also thickened up the armor. The D had introduced 30 millimeter front armor. The F took that a little further, going to 35, plus increasing the side armor from 14 to 20. Still not enough to stop most shells, but it's a little more. It's also worth pointing out they pioneered some pretty neat techniques for this armor. Whereas most tanks in the 1930s were riveted, this used a welded construction. If done properly, the welds actually made it a little stronger and lighter if done properly. That's the thing about welds. So yeah, this was introduced into World War II, 1941, and would pretty much see the production out. There were some other models attempted, but never really put into mass production. They would build about 1,800 of these, and not a lot of variation existed. They always had the 2-centimeter gun. They would go to a slightly longer and higher velocity version later in production. They did consider fitting it with a 3.7 centimeter, even a 5-centimeter gun, but since the design itself was already a little lacking, especially again in the armor department, they just saved their resources for the newer Panzers. So this is kind of where it stopped. But it was a very important tank in the early days, like the Netherlands, Norway, France, and it saw a lot of use in Russia early on. And it was maybe not their best scouting vehicle, but it was used effectively as a scout because pretty good top speed, pretty reliable engine, and by this point the Panzer crews are probably at the peak of their performance. They've had enough training and experience, but they're not worn down yet. So yeah, 1940, 41, that's probably the height of their skill before things start to deteriorate. So these were becoming very obsolete, but they would remain in service. In fact, the final units, or at least variants, would not come out of the factory until the very beginning of 1944. But that was pretty much them just using up leftover parts at that time. But it would remain very much in service throughout. As I said a minute ago, a number were sent to North Africa, where Rommel definitely used the Panzer II more than he did the I. And they would serve in pretty much every major theater. And they would be around up until the end of the war, at least in one capacity or another. Well, I appreciate you hanging out with me. Let me know how I did on my first attempt at a German armor video. It really is going to be fun, I think, to see the evolution, in some cases devolution, of the German tank throughout the war. And in a lot of ways, yeah, most of these tanks, even if they survived the war, they weren't used after the war because the Allies and the Russians, well, the Russians probably out, you know, I mean, the British, the Americans, and the Russians really pushed tanks in a different direction. But since World War I really didn't see Germany building any tanks outside of like 20 of the A7Vs late in the war, this was their first go at it. And it's interesting to see their armored doctrine. The Treaty of Versailles really forced them to have a clean slate approach. And in some ways that was very beneficial. While the Panzer I and Panzer II were probably inferior to a lot of the tanks of the day, at least technically, the training of the crews, the use of radios, just coordination, it really showed the potential there. But that's a story we'll talk about throughout these videos. As always, if you could, please do like, share, and subscribe. And as always, I hope I got at least some of this on the camera for you. It is what it is. This is Misha, and I'll catch you very soon next time.